Hey, how you doing?
Good. How are you?
All is well, all is well. First and foremost, thank you so much for coming on the platform. This is really an honor. I appreciate you stopping by.
No problem. I'm honored to be with you.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. You've been doing some major work for a while now. For the viewers who may not recognize you, could you let them know who you are and definitely where you're from?
Okay. My name is Warren Brown. I'm professor of medieval history at the California Institute of Technology in Pasadena.
Okay, okay, cool, cool. So I guess my next question is this: when did you develop a passion for history, and in particular medieval history?
The passion for history has been there right from the beginning. As far back as I can remember, I was interested in finding out about things that happened a long time ago. Um, to be honest, I could be any kind of historian. It doesn't have to be medieval. All history is cool. Um, I came to medieval history for professional reasons. Um, how do I put this? Um, I started out life not as an historian, but as a musician. And I lived in Europe for many years as a freelance classical musician. And while I was there, I learned to speak German. I got to know European history a little bit better. And when I decided that music was not going to work out for me as a career, um, I kind of cast around for what's next. And it occurred to me to pay attention to what I spent all my time doing, which was going to museums, tramping through the forests, following Roman aqueducts, that sort of thing. So I decided to go back to school and become a historian. And I thought maybe I'd do early America. That would be kind of cool before the revolution. But the problem with doing American history is there are about 400 years of it, and everybody and their cat is doing it. So you don't have much room to define yourself. Um, and another thing I'd always wanted to do was ancient Rome, but I'd never studied Latin. Uh, and no classics department would let me in without Latin. But I happened to be at Cincinnati at the time, at the University of Cincinnati, where I'd been studying music. And I walk over to the history department and I find out that the medievalists would let me in and let me learn Latin on the fly. And if you push the Middle Ages really, really, really early, you get to late Rome. So I said, okay, that's what I'm going to do. And it turned out to be really fascinating because the period I specialize in, the early Middle Ages, is this period of change when classical Rome becomes something else that then becomes medieval Europe. It's this, you go from about 500 AD to 1000 when Rome ends, and really, I think the Middle Ages start. And you've got this profound period where you can see the past, but you can also see the future. And I found this really got to me. So I jumped in with both feet.
Wow, okay, that sounds amazing. Traveling through Europe and getting to perform music, even if you didn't pursue it as a career, just to have that experience. A lot of people dream about that. I'm a world traveler myself. I'm currently in Ghana, but I definitely enjoy spending a lot of time in Europe for sure.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Now I can ask you this: by you being a historian of the Middle Ages, do you think that like movies and Hollywood have they done a good job portraying, what it was like back then? Because even growing up as a kid, it always seemed fascinating. You see the people with the armor, you see the wars and the different events that go on.
To be honest, it's a mixed bag. There have been some good movies, and there have been some that I just have to shake my head and say, "Didn't you guys ask anybody?" um, but there was a really good movie that came out a few years ago called The Last Duel about the very last judicial combat that was fought in France at the end of the Middle Ages. Uh, I forget who was in it. Um, it had some pretty big stars in it, but that was pretty well done. Um, yeah. On the other hand, even longer ago was a Beowulf movie. The with Angelina Jolie as the monster's mother. I don't know if you ever saw it. That one was kind of a joke. So it's a mixed bag. But sometimes I have to, as an historian, when I watch a movie or a TV show, I have to kind of put it to the side and say, okay, this is entertainment. Let's enjoy it. A good place to look if you're looking to get a better sense for what the Middle Ages was like were streaming TV series rather than movies. Uh, the best one that I saw recently was The Last Kingdom. It's set in early medieval England, and they do a really good job of bringing that world to life. So there are some good ones out there.
Okay, okay. I'm gonna definitely check those out for sure. You had mentioned something earlier about going to the museums. For the viewers, if you haven't, always take advantage of opportunities to go to museums. You find a lot of cool stuff, and I know a lot of museums they don't let you take pictures and videos, so everything is not on Google, everything is not in the books, and it's not online. So
Hmm. Yeah, a lot of museums will let you take pictures.
yeah, yeah, some still do for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, now I wanted to ask you. You had wrote a couple different books. If you could talk about, the process to writing these books and what inspired you. I wanted to ask you about Unjust Seizure. If you could talk about that.
Unjust Seizure was my very first book. Um, and the way it works in my field is when you go through graduate school, you have to prove to the profession that you know what you're doing. So you write what used to be called a masterpiece in the old fashioned sense that proves that you're worthy of being a master. Um, in this case, this book was my PhD dissertation that I then reworked, turned into a book, and published to show the rest of the profession that, yes, this idiot knows what he's doing. Um, at the heart of the book is a basic question: how does power work in a world of low technology where you don't have the internet, you don't have spy satellites or drones, you don't even have telephones or telegraphs? It takes 2 weeks to get anywhere on foot. You can only sail in good weather. Armies, an early medieval army, it numbers in the thousands, not in the tens of thousands or millions. So it's a very low technology, low power environment. But you've got a king, Charlemagne, lived around 800. That man ruled all of Europe. Okay. How does that work? How does one man in this kind of world get people all the way across a continent to care what he says? Okay. Well, Charlemagne was a very good general. And when he showed up with his army, you paid attention. Okay. But he couldn't be everywhere at once. So my question was, why do people participate in an early medieval regime? How does power work? And I was lucky uh, in that in southeastern Europe, a bunch of records from churches and monasteries survive. Local records, property records, people selling property to each other, giving property to each other, and more important, fighting with each other over property rights. Um, they survive from about 750 to 950 were the ones I looked at. And so the idea I had was, okay, let's take a look at these and see. Charlemagne moved into that area in the 780s and took it over. And by 800, he's in charge. Okay, so my question is, who cares? Okay. So I look at these records of property disputes before, during, and after Charlemagne's conquest to see to what degree he mattered. When people are fighting with each other over property today, you go to a court. and the court is a representative of the state. Okay. So that tells us the state is powerful. The state matters. The state helps us solve our disputes. I wanted to see if Charlemagne mattered. Before he got there, people are pretty much solving disputes by working out arrangements with each other, compromises. But after Charlemagne shows up, you start to see courts and judges and royal officials at these disputes. And you start to see, rather than compromises, you start to see decisions in favor of one or the other. And then I looked more closely at who was using these courts. And what I found was that I don't know what your family is like, but a lot of families fight with each other over property and over inheritance, right? What I found was that branches of families were using these royal courts to take property away from other branches of families. In other words, the courts were useful. I also found that Charlemagne's officials, the judges and whatnot, they came from local families. In other words, the short answer to how power worked in this period was that people found that they could use it for their own purposes. What made Charlemagne such a great ruler is he made himself useful. He made it to people's advantage to participate in his government, and they could use it in their own interests, which to me was an eye-opener, because that explains how a kingdom like that is that big, that doesn't have near the coercive power of a modern state, how it can work. And that is, people agree that it works because they find it useful. So that's basically what that book was about.
Oh wow, that's definitely interesting. I appreciate you sharing that. Now I can ask you. I know you wrote a lot, but have you ever considered doing a documentary? You know, about one of your books or the research that you have done?
I have, but I'm not really sure how it would work. That world is closed to me. I don't know anything about it. Um, I mean, I've often thought it would be fun to take my classroom lectures and turn them into something bigger, or to do a documentary about one of my other books. But to be honest, I haven't a clue how to begin to start.
Oh, okay, yeah, because you know a lot of times, you know, those movies they be based on books and stuff, you know, but people always obviously say the book is always better, but you know.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that movie that I talked about, The Last Duel, it's based on a book, and the book is really good. I was kind of jealous because he found a good story and he told it well. So I'd almost go to the book before I'd go to the movie.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Okay, now conflict in medieval Europe. If you could speak about that a little bit.
That is a what's called an edited volume. It's common in our field to write a book in a group where you get a group of people together and talk about stuff, hold a conference, and then publish all the papers from the conference in one volume. And that's what that book is. What we were looking at was how people handled conflict in a very different world from our own. It's kind of an extension of the question I asked in Unjust Seizure. How does power work? Do courts matter? Do people pay attention to kings? Or do they settle disputes among themselves? And that volume takes on the question of how people did this from the early Middle Ages on into the 11th and 12th century, where kings start to get very strong. Um, and what's interesting about the book is that a lot of us were using social anthropology. It's been one of the ways that medieval history has progressed in the last 30, 40 years, or even longer. that we've started to read what anthropologists say about non-Western societies. You know, go to Africa, go to South America, go look at indigenous societies, look at people who don't think like Westerners, and see how they do stuff. And then go back to our sources and see if that helps us. There's a very famous line. It actually came from a novelist, not from an historian. But the line goes, the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. And that's what we were trying to do, is look at the medieval past, how people handled conflict, as if it was a foreign country, and to use insights from anthropology as well as our traditional Western mindset. So that volume basically explores that. And we all go off in our different directions. So if I were to try to summarize it, I'd probably fail. But that's what that book is out to do. I did something similar with a later book that you asked about when you emailed me, Documentary Culture and the Laity. That one was fun. Again, it was a group of 10 people who decided to tackle a really important and old question. I don't know if you've heard the old stereotype, but one of the, there are lots of stereotypes that float around about the Middle Ages. And one of them is that people forgot how to read and write. And that the only people who remembered how to read and write were people in the church and monks. So you've got this image of monks sitting in their dark rooms by candlelight, scribbling away, preserving Western civilization because they're the only ones who know how to write it down. Well, there were a group of us that started talking to each other at conferences and saying, I'm not sure that's quite right, because I've got this little piece of evidence over here that says ordinary people, some of them knew how to read and write too. And so we decided to get all of our bits and pieces together and compare them. And it took us several years. We met for 5 or 6 years before we decided to write a book about this. And it was really a jointly written book. We sat down in a room and compared pieces and really put it together as a whole. And the conclusion we came to was that this image that only churchmen could read and write stems mainly from the fact that most of our sources, the written material that survives from the period, all comes from churches and monasteries. And the reason for that is simple. Churches and monasteries are the only institutions that survive from the period. So it's their archives that we have. But if you look in the cracks, if you look for single references, if you look, for example, at an account of a dispute that says Jim and Bob were fighting over property, and they go to a court, and Bob brings a document that says it's his property. Whoops, that's evidence that Bob knew something about documents. If you go to Spain, I forget how many years ago, a farmer was digging in his field and found pieces of slate, rock, with scratchings on it. And they deciphered the scratchings, and it turns out they were property records. People were using slate as paper. Never would have figured that out if the archaeologists hadn't dug it up. The same thing with wooden tablets in North Africa. Okay. Every once in a while in Europe, a church would get hold of somebody's property, and the person that sold it to them would give them all the documents. It's like you sell your house and you hand over all the records concerning the house. So in that one time and space, all of a sudden we've got a group of property records that have nothing to do with the church. They concern that property. So we put together a pretty powerful argument that no, all sorts of people could read and write in the early Middle Ages. And the impression that they couldn't is what we call an artifact of the source, that it's because of source survival that it looks that way. But if you look in the cracks and you put all the little tiny surviving pieces of evidence together, you get an image of a really different world. We were kind of proud of that, actually.
Wow, wow, that sounds amazing. Now I have to ask you, when you present new arguments like that that kind of go against, like you say, people have stereotypes of what happened. Is it something like that well received, or do you get a lot of pushback from, scholars and, readers as well?
In this case, we we got a little bit of pushback, but not much. One of the reasons I'm so proud of this book is that it's had a big impact, and we've made a lot of people rethink how they understand literacy and the use of writing in the period. And the most important thing we've done is we've actually affected people who work in other periods. Because if you get somebody who works in the late Middle Ages or in the modern period, they'll just assume, oh, everybody did things in the early Middle Ages by speaking. You wanted to give somebody property, you get together and say, I, Bob, promise to give you this property and let's shake hands. But after they've read our book, they can't assume that anymore. And it's changing how they're doing their work. Um, no, where I think I've had more pushback fighting stereotypes is with my work on violence. Um, that's another important thread of my work. If if studying conflict was where I started, conflict and power, part of me went off in one direction to look at the written documents themselves, the sources that I use, and to try to understand them. And that's what led to the documentary culture book. But another strand has kept pushing into the conflict angle and the power angle. And it ended up pushing me into studying violence. And now you talk about stereotypes. The stereotype that the Middle Ages was a really violent period. I'm sure you know that one. That's what Hollywood movies are all about. And people just assume that it was a more violent period than our own. Um, a publisher asked me to write a book about it. So I started poking around and I found out some very interesting things. It's really hard to get homicide statistics that long ago because very few people were keeping them. But what images we can get say that on an absolute level, when you're talking about body count, the Middle Ages weren't any more violent than today. I would say that modern New York or Moscow or maybe Paris are more dangerous places than 13th century England. Um, yeah. No, what's responsible for the stereotype, the way I like to put it, is people in the Middle Ages were differently violent. And let me explain what that means. Again, you're in a world where there's no such thing as a state. You have kings, but they're nowhere near as powerful as modern states. That only starts to happen towards the end of the Middle Ages. For much of the Middle Ages, kings are big men. They're just a little bit bigger than everybody else, but they don't have anything like the state with its police force and its prisons and whatnot. Which means, in terms of local conflict, people have to figure out how to handle it themselves. Um, and so you can see, going way back, even almost into the Roman period, a set of local ways of handling dispute. that rested on one fundamental idea: every man, every free man. Now, we're not talking about slaves or serfs, and we're certainly not talking about women, unfortunately. Every free man had the right to use violence on his own behalf. Okay. To defend himself, to defend his family, to defend his property, to defend his friends, his kin, but also to defend his honor, his reputation. Okay. Well, that would seem to be a recipe for chaos, but it's not, because there are mechanisms that tamp it down. If, let's say, we're living before the year 1000 in what's now France, I kill your brother. Okay. You have not only the right, but the duty to take vengeance on me. So, if I'm mad at your brother, I'm going to be making some cost benefit calculations. Taye is going to come after me if I do this. How strong is Taye? How many friends has he got? Is this worth it? Okay. So that threat right there tends to keep things under control. And so when homicide does happen, the threat of vengeance immediately makes me think, okay, either I have to run away, okay, I become outlawed, I run away from the community, or I have to fight back, which means I have to check and make sure my family and friends are willing to back me up. If they don't, if they didn't like what I did, then I have to buy you off somehow. And so what you see are very sophisticated compensation regimes where people work out by law how much I owe you for killing your brother. And that amount covers not just whatever material losses. Okay, yeah, your brother can't work the farm anymore because he's dead. It also covers the insult, the damage to your honor. It hurts me enough that you feel satisfied. And you get these things written up in law. Okay. The different amounts for different injuries, different amounts for different categories of people. And so what you get is a world that on the surface looks more violent because people are using violence in ways and in contexts that we wouldn't. We call that sort of thing now vigilante justice, and we don't like it. Okay. But in a more local world with weak state power, where everybody knows each other, and I know how many friends and kin you've got, I know how prestigious you are, I know how much it would hurt me to get crossways with you. There are all sorts of ways of negotiating, using the threat of force, occasionally displaying force. Supposing I did something that the community thought was just really horrible. Okay, I raped your sister. You come after me and you chop my head off. And you leave me in the center of town to show the whole world that you did it. The community very likely thinks that I had it coming. And you have displayed how ready you are to take vengeance, which means that the next time, nobody's going to mess with you. There are ways of settling disputes, threatening violence, using violence, but also negotiation, compromise, that look completely foreign to us, even scary, because like I said, it smacks of vigilante justice. But it works very well when you don't have a state with a police force coming in and enforcing things. So my sense is, and the argument that I made in this book, is that for much of the Middle Ages, we think the period was more violent because people were being violent differently than we would accept. But the body count probably wasn't any higher. And what happens when kings start to get really powerful and start to try to monopolize violence for themselves, the killing shifts from between you and me to the king doing it. Okay. It becomes the right of the English king to execute somebody for homicide. Okay. Well, that's the state taking vengeance when earlier it would have been you or me. So it's, yeah, it's a really alien world. Um, and that one is hard to convince people of because the stereotype is just so entrenched that this is a wildly violent world. I had a conversation at a dinner party with somebody who asked about my work, and I told them, and they just would not have it. No, the Middle Ages were, you took your life in your hands by walking out the front door. And I'm like, well, no, if I walk out the front door and somebody attacks me, the first thing I want to know as an investigator is what did I do to his sister? Or how did I insult him? Or, what's going on? Um, it's a world that ran by different rules. Um, that one is going to be harder to get out there, but I wrote the book on purpose in a very accessible way. I used sources that are translated into English. I wanted the book to get into classrooms. I wanted people like you to read it. To get people, it's one of the things that's most important to me as an historian, is to get people to change the lenses in their glasses. Too many people look at the past as an extension of the present. Either they thought just like we did, or it's a bad world because they didn't think like we do and they should have. To try to get people to really step inside the heads of people who really understood the world very differently than we do. I think that's the greatest challenge of being an historian and one of the things that I think is most important. Because if you can do that, then you can convince people, well, all right, I'll look around the world today. I'll look at what's going on in Afghanistan, in Somalia, in Palestine, or wherever. And maybe I won't be so quick to assume that they think like I do. And maybe I'll try to understand them on their own terms too.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Like you had mentioned earlier, what the films have a lot to do with it. It's a major sword fight scenes. A lot of people favorite parts in films, and it's probably hard for them to, kind of get that out of their mind that it maybe things like that didn't happen as much as we would think they have. Now, can I ask you, are you working on any books right now?
I'm right now in a recovery period from my last book. Um, the last book I wrote is called Beyond the Monastery Walls. It was an extension of this work I did on, who could read and write. Um, the the sources that I worked with, one of the ways that you can tell that more people could read and write than you might think are collections of model documents that monasteries kept. And the best way I can explain this is, have you ever seen a lawyer's form book? Do you know what that is? You go into a lawyer's office and say, I need to do this. I need to write up a contract. I need to sell some property, whatever. If it's something pretty simple, the lawyer will go over to his shelf and pull a form book off that has models for different kinds of contracts and documents and things with just the specifics left out. And he'll take that model and he'll fill in the details and he'll produce the document that you need. Well, same in the period of Charlemagne, that lots of people needed documents for things. The people who were actually writing the documents were in the churches and monasteries. So if you and I want to, if you want to sell property to me, we go to the monastery. The monastery says, okay, they pull their form book off the shelf and they've got a model for the document that you need. There are about 40 of these things that survive from the 700s and 800s. Um, the cool thing about them is that they contain models for documents that don't otherwise survive because they don't have anything to do with churches and monasteries. Remember, I said that most of what we have survives from churches and monasteries because those are the institutions whose archives survive. But these form books contain models for documents that don't survive because they don't have anything to do with the church. They tell us that people were coming to the monasteries and say, give me this kind of document, and they had models. The problem with them is, where did these monks get their models? Well, they took them from all over the place, from their own archives, from older model books, and some of them are really old. You have copies of documents back from the Roman period in the year 800 that these people are still holding on to. So it's possible to look at these things and say they're totally useless as sources because they don't have anything to do with the period that we're talking about. And the argument that I made was, no, let's look at these individual form books. And you'll find that the people who put them together were quite opinionated about what they kept, what they didn't. Sometimes they modified old documents to make them fit. They arranged everything in a logical order. You can tell that they're still using these things as inspirations. And so I tried something bold, and we'll see if it works out. The reviews on the book haven't come out yet, so I don't know how the profession's going to react. I decided to try to talk about how people outside the churches and monasteries lived based on these documents. Now, this is tricky because you're not talking about real people. You're talking about shadow people. You're talking about what these model documents say people might have done. Okay, these are collections put together by monks who said, okay, people are going to come here and ask me for a document. I better be ready. So here are all the documents I think I might need. So what we have is an imagined world of possibility, if I could get poetic for a second. A possible world, not a real world, a possible world. Well, okay, let's go look at that possible world because that's as close as we're going to get. And so I wrote a book about what people did with their lives that used documents from these form books. I talked about property. I talked about inheritance. I talked about marriage. I talked about the difference between free people and not free people. I talked about justice. I talked about how women fit in. In this imagined world, women are pretty powerful. They can own property. They can sell property on their own. What did people get in trouble for? Okay. What I was telling you about a minute ago about compensating somebody for a homicide. These form books contain receipts. Person A killed the brother of person B. There was a negotiation. He paid the compensation, and person B gave him a receipt. We have forms for these receipts. So, yeah, it's an effort to get at a lost world by looking at how the people who put together these form books imagined the world might be. That book just came out last year. Like I said, it's called Beyond the Monastery Walls. We'll see how the profession reacts. And I'm in a recovery period right now where I'm sort of sifting through my thoughts and deciding on what's next.
Oh, okay. Wow, that truly sounds interesting. I mean, it provokes a lot of thought because it gives us more insight to what could be. because
Yeah,
we only have so much to go off of because we weren't there. But it's a very interesting time period, nevertheless. And I want to thank you again. I really, really appreciate you for coming on the platform. We went a couple minutes over, but I definitely value your time, and I'm thankful for the contributions that you have made. And I definitely look forward to the work that you have to come in the future.
I really appreciate you seeking me out and giving me the chance to talk.
Oh yeah, it's definitely an honor, and I thank the viewers for tuning in. So until
Okay,
next time.
thank you.
All right. Take care.